This lesson will focus on run-on sentences, one of the most common types of grammatical errors that college students make in their writing. Run-on sentences can be very confusing, and they can also make your writing look unsophisticated or even immature. So this is definitely something that you want to eliminate from your writing. I've found that most college freshmen have at least some run-on sentences in their writing. It is by far the most common type of grammatical error I see when I read students writing. So if you're a college freshman and you're in my class, it is very likely that you will have at least some run-on sentences in your writing, and you want to work toward eliminating these. Here's the basic definition of what a run-on sentence is. Run-on sentences occur when two or more sentences are written as one sentence. In order to correct a run-on sentence, divide the sentence into two separate sentences. Certain words, such as and, because, and since, can also be used to combine complete sentences into a single sentence, and that's something we'll talk about later in this lesson. Let's start with a short pretest. Use this pretest to see what you know already about run-on sentences. Decide if each of the following sentences is correct as written or is incorrect. For sentences that are incorrect, decide what change needs to be made. Here's the first one. Pause the video for a moment and read the sentence. Decide if you think it's correct or incorrect, and if it's incorrect, try to figure out what correction is needed. Okay, I'm going to give the answer now. This sentence was incorrect as written. You may recognize that there are really two complete sentences here. The college offers financial aid, and it encourages students to apply. These are also sometimes called independent clauses. Later in this lesson, we'll talk a little more about what makes these two sentences complete. As is often the case in writing, there are many ways of fixing the same problem. But there are ways of fixing the problems that are considered standard or correct, and then there are ways that are considered non-standard or incorrect. Here is the correctly written sentence. The simplest way to correct this incorrectly written sentence is to divide it into two separate sentences by placing a period here in between the two sentences. That's one very simple correction that will always correct a run-on sentence. Now let's look at another one. Again, pause the video for a moment and read the sentence carefully. Decide if you think it's correct or incorrect, and if incorrect, what correction it needs. This sentence was also incorrect as written. There are also two complete sentences, or independent clauses, here. Last year I took a math class at night school, and then I took another in science. As I mentioned earlier, certain words, called conjunctions, can be used to combine complete sentences, but then is not a conjunction, so it cannot be used to join these two sentences. We'll look more at conjunctions later in the lesson. Here's a correction for this sentence. As with the first item in this pretest, the simplest way to correct a run-on sentence is to divide it into two separate sentences by placing a period in between the two sentences. Here's one last item for our pretest. Pause the video and decide if or not the sentence needs a correction. This sentence is incorrect, and you might also notice that it's confusing. There are two complete sentences here. I passed both courses, and I know I can do well in my future classes. In between these two sentences, we have the phrase with hard work, but it's not clear which sentence with hard work belongs to. Does the writer mean she passed both classes because she worked hard, or does she mean that she'll have to work harder in the future? Or both? We can't really tell by the way the sentence is written, so this is a good example of how run-on sentences can be really confusing for your reader. Here's one possible correction for this sentence. Of course, it's really impossible to know what the original writer wanted to say unless we ask her, and that's the problem that run-on sentences can present. But if we place a period after work, the sentence is at least grammatically correct as written. Now we're going to look at a process you can use to help identify run-on sentences in your writing. If you've been told you have run-on sentences in your writing, you should follow this process for each and every sentence in everything you write. This should always happen during the editing and proofreading stage of the writing process, after you've written a draft of an essay. Try not to think about grammar and spelling while you're doing your writing. Here are the steps to use when trying to identify run-on sentences. First, circle all the verbs in the sentence. Next, ask yourself who or what is doing the action for each of these verbs. Find the word that answers this question for each verb. This is the subject for the verb. Underline it. Then, look for a word that connects the subject-verb combinations, such as and, because, and since. More on this below. If you have two or more subject-verb combinations without a word to connect them, you have a run-on sentence. Later in this lesson, we'll talk about some different strategies you can use to correct run-on sentences once you've identified them. Now let's practice identifying some run-on sentences by following the 4 steps we just went over. The 4 steps are listed at the bottom of the screen. Here's the first one. Step 1 is to first circle all the verbs in the sentence. The verbs in this sentence are committed and has given. Step 2 is to ask ourselves who or what is doing the action for each of these verbs, which tells us the subject. We're then supposed to underline the subject. In this sentence, I tells us who is committed, and it tells us what has given new purpose to the writer's life. In step 3, we look for a word that connects any subject-verb combinations. This sentence has 2 subject-verb combinations. I am committed and it has given. Every sentence has to have at least one subject and at least one verb in order to be complete. If a sentence has more than one subject-verb combination, the sentence also has to have a conjunction like and, but, or because to connect those subject-verb combinations. This sentence contains the conjunction because, which links the 2 subject-verb combinations in the sentence. So going on to step 4, we find that this is not a run-on sentence. We have 2 subject-verb combinations, but the word because connects them, making the sentence complete. Now try this one on your own. Pause the video for a moment while you work through this example. Remember to follow the steps listed here at the bottom of the screen. Following step 1, you should have identified did, take, and drifted as the verbs that need to be circled in this sentence. Following step 2, you should have identified I as the subject of the verb did not take because I answered who did not take control. And you should have identified I as the subject of the verb drifted because I answers who did the drifting. So in this sentence, we have 2 subject-verb combinations. But following step 3, we do not have a word that connects the 2 subject-verb combinations. We just have a comma in between them. So this is a run-on sentence. The simplest way to correct this error is to place a period in between these 2 complete sentences by placing a period in place of the comma. We'll talk about some other options for correcting run-on sentences like this later on in the lesson. This concludes part 1 of this lesson. If you're viewing this as part of a module in Canvas, click on Take the Quiz below the video to get some more practice with identifying run-on sentences. If you're having trouble with the quiz items, watch the video again. If you still have trouble, contact me to get some extra help.